if you're like you like social aussi whatever. What?
We gotta come. I missed something. I'm just yeah. We gotta come. It was really. I can tell you, I was exhausted. Quite comfy. It's good to be honest.
Unfortunately, to the
Very similar, like 80 pounds.
and then I had to get from Asia. He cleaned the data.
Yeah, which is like 20 pounds.
I didn't realize it was like that. That's how
I genuinely wanted to. I was just thinking, like, if she's like open to like, because I guess
Oh yeah. By 7 hours no.
I like it a lot.
She hated it. Just enjoy. It's a bit weird. It's all fine.
Whenever I get the mail, there's like
I'm doing tomorrow. I'll ask me to ask.
oh, right. I don't know why not. I've never done no, because like if you keep copying. I contacted them. I'm waiting for them, and then I did
No, like my use was right?
I love that. I was literally.
You mentioned it in everything.
It could just go up to my room. I You did yesterday. Gotta be ready for God whatsoever.
Hi everyone, we're gonna start. I hope you're well. It's week 11 now, so the last week of the term. Congratulations for making it so far. And today we're gonna discuss directed technical change. So we're gonna start with some motivating facts. And then at the end of the lecture, we'll talk about the ACMODU Alguion Buzinous 2012 paper that is a model of how to direct innovation. But first, we're going to see why we still need green innovation and why this is really important for green policy. Okay. So why do we still need innovation? Then we'll look at why costs decrease over time. So we'll try to investigate different stages of technological change and the associated market failures. And finally, the theory on directed technological change. The learning outcomes for today are to try to understand the role of innovation in climate change mitigation, why there is a rationale for technology policy, so mostly through subsidies. And finally, why optimal climate policy is not just carbon pricing. We're going to see that it also relies on research subsidies. So let's start with some motivating facts. I don't know if some of you are working on innovation, but actually the International Energy Agency has done a very interesting modeling on what it would take to reduce emissions in order to meet a net zero target by 2070. And they have all the data available on their website. And according to their model, the key challenge is that only 25% of emissions reduction relies on mature technologies, meaning technologies that are already commercialized large scale, so basically technologies that are cheap enough to be used, such as wind, that you may know, wind turbines, such as solar electricity, etc. So there's a lot of progress to achieve and reduce emissions by the remaining 75%. So you can see how massive that is. On many things, especially carbon capture that you may have heard of, utilization, storage, low carbon hydrogen, bioenergy, biofuel. So there's quite a lot of things that we know we are going to need. But but we don't really know how to make them work in practice, or if we know that the market is not mature yet, they are not widespread in our daily lives. And here, so I was mentioning this tool, this data set 2 minutes ago. So there's this interactive tool to track tech readiness. So I think it's very interesting. And basically, they have classified technologies into 4 categories: mature, early adoption, demonstration, and prototype. And they show how we can reduce emissions today and reach net zero emissions by 2070. Obviously, it's probably a bit small for the one sitting in the back, but nevertheless, you can already see that mature is just a small share of emissions, and there's all the rest. And it's not only that the rest only concerns early adoption technologies, so technologies that we expect to be able to adopt soon, but there are really 17% of the reduction in emission that depends on things that are just at the prototype stage, so very early on. So these are key motivating facts to show that key technologies that the energy sector needs for net zeros are known, but they are really not ready. And it is and trying to understand the cost curve. So basically, it's going to be crucially a question of the cost, how to reduce the cost of those technologies. Many technologies are untested, or they've been tested, but at this stage they remain relatively expensive, so firms are not using them. This is relatively bad news, because the higher the cost of mitigation and the more difficult it is to pass climate policies. This is something that we have discussed extensively on week 9 and 10. So mitigation cost, abatement cost, and future cost, they should really be what determines our choice of technology today. The problem with future cost is that they are uncertain, so you don't know how much you're going to pay today. Sometimes they are hard to forecast. If you expect the cost to decrease over time, well, there's clearly an incentive to wait and not to adopt the technology right away. The good news, however, is that typically costs tend to decrease over time. And there is some research published in the Joule journal that shows, so it's not really economics, but that shows that on average, cost tends to decrease faster than expected by companies and policymakers. But nevertheless, given that they decrease over time, there is still this incentive to wait. And there is also substantial uncertainty. It's very hard, even though we know that they are going to decrease over time, we don't really know when that's going to happen. So this is to show to you the evolution of global average cost for some selected technologies. So here you have solar panels. Here you have electric vehicles batteries. And so the study stopped slightly, was written slightly before 2020. But you can see already, so these are projections. But you can see already that there's a sharp decrease in cost. And we know, all of us, that now more and more people install solar panels on their homes. And more people buy electric vehicles. And it's not only a matter of heavy subsidies on those products. It's also the fact that the cost has decreased substantially. So why do costs decrease? Well, this is a question that is really key to try to identify the market failures in order to design policies that can help us develop first and then adopt those technologies, and so the 3 questions that one should keep in mind is what happens during technological change. Which policies can accelerate? So this is really the first one. How do costs evolve over time? The second one is which policies can accelerate cost reductions? And the last one is cost decreases. The fact that cost decreases, we're going to see, are linked to market failures. So this all and this is going to justify clearly policies. So why do costs decrease over time? We are going to look at different stages of technological change and their market failures. So this is one representation that I'm going to propose of the stages of technological change. It's not the stages, they may not be such cleanly determined in real life, but you can consider that technological change, it first relies on research and development, then it's going to be commercialized, and then if there is so that's already at the stage of a market potential, and finally it's going to be diffused. So if you think of writing, I don't know, like creating some kind of chair, you can research how to make it, you can try to develop it, you can try to patent it, but whether it's going to become an innovation really relies crucially on whether it's going to be, you're going to be able to commercialize it and to diffuse it. So if, say, it's a very uncomfortable chair, it's probably going to stay at the stage of research and development and never meet commercialization or diffusion. Questions so far? So now let's look at the the outputs at each stage. And you can see that at the stage of research and development, it's more in the realm of discoveries, ideas, inventions, prototypes. And then to move from here to here, we have this idea of an innovation. So it's really the idea of an adaptation, an improvement that can be diffused, so it needs a market penetration. And here you have all the activities, so you can already see how progressively this very schematic view of the technological change, it's complexifying, and we see that at every step of the process, we have many things happening. So here I'm showing the activities, and you can see that there are many activities that are finally going to lead to the innovation and finally to the diffusion of an innovation. And now, adding the agents that make all of this possible, we have here external or firm-level initiatives, and that's the people who are doing research. So nowadays, it's mostly universities, actually, and labs that are producing the most fundamental research. There are fewer and fewer big companies that produce fundamental research. Most firms, they tend to focus at the stage right after fundamental research, trying to innovate, to build on the shoulder of giants, to innovate based on what has been already existing in terms of the molecules, etc. And finally, you have the market here. And what we're going to see is that at the first, there are two types of externalities going on. The first one being knowledge externalities, and the second one, on the diffusion side, being adoption externalities. And given that we're talking about externalities, you can already see that the idea of market failures is coming, and that's what we're going to tackle. Okay, so does anyone want to try to explain or discuss what are knowledge externalities, how they arise? Yeah.
I think basically when one firm innovates and they create, for instance, a new technology, that obviously benefits this firm, but it also benefits society as a whole or other firms in that ecosystem. For instance, if you take like the iPhone, the innovations were made, they also benefited. For instance, Google, where they could make returns. Therefore, you have an externality because Apple or like whatever firm innovates doesn't get that benefit that the other firms are creating.
Mm-hmm. Do you want to add something?
I think I was just thinking of like patents as a way to address that externality, because you create this knowledge, but everybody can use the knowledge. But if you have a patent, then nobody else is allowed to use that specific knowledge. So it kind of addresses this externality.
Yeah, so indeed, patents is something we're going to see in a few minutes, but it's a solution to address the market failure. And the market failure, it comes from the fact that research can be produced in a suboptimal way, because as a firm like Apple, you're going to benefit from your own innovation, but other firms are also going to benefit from the innovation. So ideally, people would produce even more research than they do in practice. And this is where the knowledge externality sits. The fact that knowledge builds on knowledge. So knowledge has public good properties. Once you have an idea, once it's been shared, everyone can use it before there are patents. So it's non-rival. And actually, that's what you're going to do as well when you write your dissertation, right? You're gonna build on the ideas of others, and that's what we do all the time in research. And those positive externalities are spillovers, so we diffuse knowledge that others can build on, and given that it's a positive externality, it's really this idea of the good before the market, before the public intervention, the good being under-provided. So private firms, they do not have incentive to provide the socially optimal level of research. Therefore, there's this underinvestment in R&D. And given that research results are only partly appropriable, and that's a problem. And also sometimes, when you think about it, the application can come very late. So if you think of the GPS technology, for instance, it was developed in the 70s, and it's actually based on Einstein relativity theory that was developed in the early 20th century. So you can see how sometimes there's a gap, and this is why R&D is being underfunded. Okay. So, as you rightly said, we need policies to encourage innovation. It's always the same idea when you're talking about market failures, or most of the time. And so the first key intuition could be to fund basic research that is being underprovided, either by providing research subsidies to universities, or R&D tax credits for firms. And this is really like very wide use policies. You probably have heard of the European Research Council. In France, we have one as well, but I think that most countries have one. There's the Horizon program that is also at the European scale, but the UK is part of it. So it's really this idea of making research cheaper to increase production. And the other option is research and development through tax credits. So firms are going to receive an income tax credit if they invest in R&D. So this is quite simple. The patent protection, the idea is to incentivize research by making knowledge proprietary. So you're going to, when you want to declare a patent, to get one, what you're going to do is that you're going to disclose what you're doing, but people will have to cite you, etc. So this is really the idea of making knowledge proprietary, so that you're going to benefit from it, and it encourages you to make more of it. It's a bit unclear at this stage whether patenting has been, and we're going to see some example about research subsidies and tax credits. For patenting, it's a bit unclear whether it's really successful in creating innovation, but at least what's quite interesting is that it allows us to study where which sectors are going to try to innovate, etc. So we're going to be able, at least because it creates huge data set where we have all the information, so it makes the diffusion of knowledge easy to track with those databases. It is actually feasible to see which firms are going to innovate and whether this translates into big adoption of a technology. This is a bit less clear. And that's something we are going to discuss during the seminar on Wednesday. Yes, and
what is the argumentation why it wouldn't create innovation? Or like I didn't really understand what the discussion is.
So the idea is that, sorry, it's going to create innovation, but whether those innovations are going to really be adopted by society is less clear.
So I think the patent can itself create a problem, a market failure, not in knowledge, but maybe in applied technologies. For example, with medicines, you might think about some products that take like 20 years to get generic versions. So for example, in developing countries, this often means that medicines for the heart or something like that cost 20% of your salary if you need to go private. How many times you need to go private? So it may be socially optimal regarding knowledge, not, I don't know if socially optimal when it's applied.
Yeah, I think that you're totally right. It's like here, this is not considering any distributional justice concerns. It's really this idea of like, from a firm perspective, you are not encouraged to produce research if you think that people are going to benefit from it as well. And so this is like a very simple, simplistic profit vision. I think it holds for firms, however, but then it's true that in practice, for like the cost of society can be high, and there's a lot of debate around, like for instance, sharing clean technologies in international environmental agreements between countries, etc. So this is a very fair point. Okay. So trying to understand how, so spillovers in energy innovation, there is this paper from Myers and Lanahan in 2022 that looks at R&D spillovers created by grants. So in that case, it's subsidies to firms in the US, if I remember well. And the idea is try to understand the magnitude of spillovers across geographic and technological space. Because there's been a long-standing tradition of subsidizing research, trying to provide subsidies to firms, tax credits, etc. But the question is it really working? And sometimes it's not so easy to assess. So their question is whether knowledge spills geographically and technologically. So from one sector, like the sector of the firm, what is the technological distance that is being reached by the patent? So you can look at that when you have the patent data because there's a fairly detailed classification of all the sectors of activity. And so you can look at how many sectors a patent moves, like where it started, where it was developed and how it's being used. And so they look at how those subsidies translate into patents. And they find that there are large effects. So for every one patent produced by grant recipients, in this case, they expect 3 additional patents to be produced by other inventors across the US and around the world. So there's really this idea that one additional patent produced through funding is going to create 3 additional patents. So the idea that basically the spillover when it comes to R&D knowledge is quite large. Yes.
Is it about patents like in the same area of research or like products, or is it like across different?
So here it's really all over. I think that in the paper there is more detail and you have the result, but this is like the most general result. And then they have result about the heterogeneity, and what you can see is that this is the technological distance percentile. So on average, the grant recipients, the patents are being benefited at different levels up to 30%, 40% of distance to the initial patent of the firm that received it. So it means that patents are moving very fast. And you can see that the patents, they are mostly being concentrated in the US. So within the US, when one company gets the research subsidies, it mostly creates patents in the surrounding. So for the surrounding companies, and it probably means that in the US, research is quite concentrated in terms of the industries. So for instance, in the Silicon Valley, you have most of the tech industries, etc. So this explains this result. But we can also see, and this is a figure that actually aggregates a lot of results, so maybe it's not the easiest to see, but I still wanted to show it to you, that there are also knowledge spillovers for foreign countries that are going to benefit and use the patents. So basically, it works as follows. One firm received some subsidy, some tax credit for research. This is going to result in the creation of some patents, and other firms, either elsewhere in the US or elsewhere in the world, are going to create new patents based on this new technology that has been discovered thanks to the research subsidy. So this is really the idea of knowledge spilling over, explaining why when there is no tax subsidy, when there is no policy, there is an under provision of knowledge. Questions? Yeah.
I've got a question on competitiveness. So if a firm wants to protect its core technologies, right, they will apply for patent, right?
Yes. Can you speak
Like for
louder?
competitiveness. So if a firm wants to protect their core technologies, like NVIDIA, for example, on chips, right, they won't like, patent their chips technology, and Chinese can just use it to mass produce like chips based on that technology. So how does that facilitate knowledge transfer, like for very competitive firms?
Can you repeat the question? Sorry.
The way I say it is patent is just for the not core technologies of a firm that they want to play around, share knowledge and stuff. But if it's like core technologies of a firm, right, like aerospace and stuff, that is national security, it's important enough for the firm's competitiveness of the countries, then they won't really patent those technologies out, and that does not really help knowledge transfer in a way, right?
Yeah, so I'm not an expert in innovation policies, but I guess that indeed you have different incentives, and some technologies, they can also stay protected. I think that in the system of patent, there are also some technologies where you can patent and not disclose the technology for a little while. So like there are different, so this is like, I think the most simple patenting system. But indeed, there are ways where you can protect your patent, avoid usage, etc., to make sure for core technologies. So in the UK, there's actually been a commission made by, and this is from a report from the Center of Economic Performance that has tried to understand how the UK industrial strategy is working The idea was that the key aim was to support high productivity, high growth sectors for which the UK has a comparative advantage. But in practice, they argue in this report that the relevant criterion should not be the comparative advantage of the UK, but really the idea of spillovers and where knowledge spills, given that ideally, from a country perspective, you may want to subsidize the research in sectors that are going to spill over for national firms rather than trying to help competitors all around the world, etc. So what they say is that there are spillovers from low carbon innovation in energy production and transport that are higher than in conventional technologies. So there is an interest in the UK in investing in subsidizing low carbon research to foster innovation. And unsurprisingly, they find that it's not really on solar energy that we should focus our efforts in the UK, but rather wind, if I remember well. So they really have this idea, and it's actually quite important for policymakers to understand to whom the subsidies are benefiting. Because as we are going to see, sometimes for some key technologies, they can really benefit countries with whom you are competing in terms of trade. But I think that this whole debate around what to subsidize and how you expect knowledge to spill overs, etc. Overall, it all, going back to your question, it all boils down to the very question of what is the aim of subsidizing the technology. If it's a matter of trying to build more knowledge to develop core technologies in order to fight climate change, it can probably be okay or acceptable to subsidize technologies, research for technologies that are going to spill over across different countries. On the other hand, if it's an industrial strategy at the country level, maybe you're less interested in doing that and you really want to identify which sectors within your country are going to benefit the most and have the highest spillovers within your national borders. So it really depends on what is the goal of the technology. For instance, when it comes to health, patents have a less clear interest, etc. So now we just discussed knowledge externalities, but there's another type of externalities that are actually quite crucial, and that are this idea of adoption externalities. So adoption externalities, they boil down to the idea of a dynamic increasing returns that agents disregard. So you can think of learning by using. I think that this is the most common adoption externality that we may have in mind. The fact that the adopter of a new technology creates a positive externality for others in the form of the generation of information about the existence, the characteristics, the success of a new technology. So when you think 2-3 years back, when you first started hearing about AI, for instance, I don't know, I guess that someone told you like, hey, have you heard about like ChatGPT? It's quite amazing, you can do this and that. And this is really the idea of learning by using, and how the first mover, in a way, the first adopter, sometimes pays some kind of a fixed cost that decreases over time as more and more people start using the technology. And so it's really this idea. For firms, there is a similar idea that is more related to learning by doing. So the fact that production costs, they tend to fall as manufacturers, they gain production experience. And it's not really related to the idea of economies of scale here. It's really rather the idea that learning spills over the benefit to other manufacturers. So progressively, as a firm develops production processes, for instance, it's gonna start reducing the cost of production. But the competitive firms in the same sector, they may also start benefiting from it by observing how you produce, trying to attract workers from your company, etc. So there's really this idea of learning by doing that is an important adoption externality here. So basically, the key thing is that you don't really have an interest in being the first mover in neither of those cases. So there is this working paper by Covert and Sweeney. It's more an IO industrial organization paper, but in this paper they try to understand what is making wind turbines cheaper over time to produce. Given that the technology for wind turbines is relatively simple, and so they study learning by doing externality, so how progressively the cost of wind turbines has been decreasing over time. And the result in this paper is that learning economies, they are large at the turbine level. So firms, they have their own turbine that they produce, and progressively the cost of producing the turbine over time, it decreases because there is this learning by doing. But there is also, the same phenomenon is actually happening also at the industry level, where firms observe each other, and this benefits the incumbents, the new firms entering the market. So there is really this dynamic aspect that subsidizing today, it will generate learning that will reduce future costs, and those reductions, they will spread across the industry via spillovers, justifying the idea of subsidies. So that's the main idea from the paper. And I don't know if you can clearly see, but basically they compare the dominant Western manufacturer, Vestas, when it comes to wind turbines. So Vestas had been receiving quite a lot of subsidies from the US and Germany, if I recall well. And Goldwind, that is the main Chinese competitor, and that has arrived after on the market. And so they compare the costs. So the first thing is the original equipment manufacturer. So basically, what has happened with the spillovers, which is what we observe, and they try to simulate what would have happened had spillover, had knowledge, had learning by doing, not spilled. And so they find that a gap that is basically the value of inherited global spillover, so how much we have won in terms of cost reduction thanks to the spillovers. And so here you have the log cost of the size, and here you have the time axis. And what you can see is that, so in blue you have Vestas, and in red you have Goldwind. The little round circles indicate what would have happened without spillovers and what has happened with it in the triangles. And you can see for Vestas that the two curves align quite a lot, because Vestas was the first mover, and there's a clear decrease in the cost over time. Whereas for Goldwind, which entered the market later, which is why we have fewer points for Goldwind, there is a much bigger gap. And actually, the real cost for Goldwind has been decreasing over time very sharply, and it would have stayed much higher had knowledge not spillover. So basically, had it entered the market without benefiting from all the learning by doing that Vestas had done. So this is just a paper to illustrate how important knowledge spillover is. It's not super easy to measure, actually. They do it in the case of wind turbines because this is relatively easy to investigate. because there are fewer components to wind turbines and other types of goods actually. And when it comes to studying innovation, it's sometimes quite complicated because we lack data. In general, we have those patent data that I started talking about, and we're going to talk about more on Wednesday. But firms, they are not willing to share their costs. They are not willing to share how much they are spending in terms of research, etc. So sometimes the other thing we can observe in general is the subsidies, because this is a public matter. Okay? Great. How are we doing on time? So and the last type of externality is the idea of network externalities. So they exist if a product becomes technologically more valuable to an individual user as you have more and more users adopting the product. So why is it different from a normal good, in your opinion?
Like usually I would say I don't really care what other people use. Whereas if I use, for instance, a platform, like if I use Instagram or Facebook or whatever, and I would be there on my own, I wouldn't really enjoy that. Whereas if there's everyone else on there, you have much higher utility for yourself.
Exactly. So it's really this idea that in general, when you think about a normal good, if you consume abstracting from social components and social influence, if you consume a fruit, for instance, you're going to consume it for yourself, and you don't really care whether other people in the room are consuming a fruit. But for there are some goods where really network matters, and it's actually the case for innovations. You can think of and this was at the stage of a user, as you said, so a social network user already, you can easily imagine why it's so important not to be the only one in the network. But actually, it is also an important matter for companies, because sometimes they are the ones building the network. When you can think of, we think of different types of phone chargers, for instance, where it's really annoying to have many different types of phone chargers. So there is a benefit in a way to having as many people as possible using the same compatible product. And this may sound like silly examples, but when you think about some clean technologies, it's actually quite crucial. What kind of technologies can you have in mind?
Like EV chargers, standards for lithium batteries.
Mm-hmm. Was it the same? Okay. So indeed, for EVs, it's very important, because if you need to charge your vehicle, you don't want to, you're going to be stuck. And basically, if the network is super scattered or very weak, there are too few charging stations, or everyone uses different standards. As we are going to see, this is a key problem for the adoption of cleaner energies, for instance. You can also think about the grid, etc. EV, I think it's the most straightforward example. So it's a market failure, because left to themselves, every firm, more or less, has an interest to develop their own charger in the shape that they want and sell their product that corresponds to it. And the problem is that in that case, market can get stuck in a bad equilibrium. Instead of all using USB-C, you're going to have the iPhone, the blah, 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 and it's extremely annoying. And that's at the most basic level. Obviously, when we talk about climate change, the consequences can be much more damaging. So the idea could be that there are competing incompatible standards where the network is going to be fragmented and everyone is worse off. So here, no individual firm has the incentive to adopt a rival standard. And that's the key idea here when we think about firm competition. even if coordination would benefit everyone. So, so the policy intervention that the most standard is to mandate a common standard that can force coordination that the market won't achieve on its own. So here there is no, interestingly, it's really one of the few cases where we're not talking about a price policy, it's really a standard. And it's not that common in economics that the standard is the first policy put forward. And actually standards are quite often used when you want to make sure that the thing is going to happen and it's not, and that prices may not, price instruments may not allow to achieve this. Okay, so there is this very cool paper that hasn't been published yet from Jing Li. I think that she may have left academia, so let's see if it gets published. But anyways, she looks at compatibility and investment in the US electric vehicle market. And basically, she tries to understand how having a standard, so everyone using the same charging technology would have affected electric vehicle adoption. And she looks at the US, where at the time, in 2010, there were 3 main electric vehicle charging standards, leading to too few charging locations, especially for Tesla. Tesla was already quite widespread in the US. And the key consequence was that users couldn't drive long distances, limiting the adoption of the clean technology. She simulates with the data, so she has a whole model, etc., and she runs a counterfactual scenario, and with where a policy mandate would have been implemented, and so instead of 3 standards, there would only have been 1, and she finds that this increases electric vehicle adoption by 20%. So you can see how network externalities can be another type of externality that limits the adoption of an innovation, and in our case, in this case, a clean innovation. And this is a map where this was just to show you at the time, in September 2015, how the distribution of the 3 main charging stations. And so you have CHAdeMO in blue, Combo in green, and the rest in orange would be Tesla. And you can see that Tesla is quite widespread. So if you want to travel all across the US with a Tesla car or a Tesla charging type, it was going to be possible. But as for the rest, it was really concentrated around the main coastal areas, at the risk of having more people using combustion engines, leading to high emissions. So why do costs decrease over time? Well, cost decrease, so this is a key question now that we have investigated different types of externalities. And actually, the cost decrease, they may result from any of the mechanisms at any stage of the whole process of technological change. So if you remember the process that I'm not going to show you again based on this graph, it can happen at quite a lot of stages. And whether it's one or the other mechanism that affects the cost decrease has important implications for how much we should abate today versus tomorrow. So both for the policy, but also for whether we should do it now or in the future. And we are going to see that this debate, have you discussed it in GY 426? The Stern-Nordhaus debate, things like that, around the discount rate? Yeah, okay. So this is actually quite key because, as you know, there are long-standing debates in economics in terms of whether one should do most of the effort, have a very strict climate policy now, or expect that in the future generations will be richer, so we don't need, we can discount the future more, etc. So this is really a very important debate, whether to know when to abate and where to subsidize. So before we take a break, almost done. The debate around whether to abate more today or tomorrow really depends on whether you think that the cost reductions will come from either learning by doing, so this externality that we were looking at, the fact that if we optimize, we can optimize production processes, that over time the costs are going to decrease because there's going to be improvement in the production processes and human capital accumulation in workers, or if you think that this is about economies of scale, so the more we produce, just the cheaper, there is then an incentive to abate more today in order to try to lower the cost. On the other end, if you think that most of the costs in reduction come from research and development, innovation spillovers, so knowledge basically, there is an incentive to wait for the new innovation that's going to come with the lower cost. So the idea is that the more uncertainty there is, as always, this can increase waiting time, making firms abate less today at the risk of degrading the environment today quite a lot. Okay. So, looking at learning by doing, so this is basically the price of solar panels, and here the cumulative installed capacity, so the total quantity installed of solar panels. Yes.
I still had a question about the previous slide.
Yeah.
Because why is the learning by doing an incentive to abate more today? Because if you can see, like, observe someone else first, then you can kind of like profit from what they are learning, right? And then it might be better to wait until someone else made the first step. Like, it depends on the number of competitors, but if there are competitors, it might be like cheaper for you to wait to make sure someone else figures out how it's done efficiently, and then once that's figured out, you jump in.
I guess that it comes from, I don't really remember where I wrote that one, but I guess it comes from the idea that if the costs are lower, then there's going to be more people joining this market, and this is going to allow further abatement. But I agree, this is probably a bit simplistic.
I mean, I think it depends a bit on who we're looking for that, like, when we say will, like, benefit. Because if you're looking from, like, societal perspective, then it makes sense that we want to start as soon as possible, but, like...
Yeah, from a firm's perspective,
yeah,
then it doesn't. Yeah, I totally agree. No, I think that this is more for policy makers rather than for firms at this stage. So do you agree with the following statement, looking at how the capacity of installed solar panels is correlated with the price of solar panels? If you look at this figure, what do you think? Do you agree with the following statement that this graph is evidence of a market failure, since it shows that the firm is learning by doing, and here the learning rate would be 20%. Yeah.
Well, it depends if it's causal. It's under a causal inference framework. However, it seems to be a correlation between both variables. So perhaps.
Yes. So why wouldn't it be causal if I were just to show you that? What other possible things could be happening? Yes.
It could be also economies of scale.
Exactly. So it could totally be economies of scale. The more you produce, the cheaper it gets. It could be also what else? Other things could be playing here.
Could be also increased competition.
And how would this affect the relation between? Because sorry, this is just for one firm. Sorry, maybe I wasn't clear. It's really for one solar panel manufacturer. But if you think about
the cost of the resources that go into the solar panels itself.
Exactly. So it could be if you think that you're a manufacturer, there's going to be your output, and your output function depends on the price of the inputs, right? So it could totally be that progressively the price of whatever you need to build solar panels has been decreasing. It could be subsidies as well. It could be economies of scale. So it's clearly like this image is hiding a lot of other possibilities, but nevertheless, this idea of learning by doing is very important in the literature, and it's actually it's important to keep in mind that other things could be going on. So it's obviously not causal evidence, and so it is not necessarily here a market failure, this idea of learning by doing being a market failure, because it's only a market failure if spillovers exist, and in this figure we cannot know it, and we cannot rule out the other explanations that we just discussed, so the variation in the price of input, economies of scale, etc. Okay. So we are done for the first part. Some conclusions so far is that technological change is not a smooth process. You saw that there are many steps and many stages with different actors, and this is something crucial to keep in mind. And that those actors possibly have different incentives to wait, not to wait, whether to distribute the money, to which sectors, etc., with the possibility also of new competitors entering the market. And so there exist several market failures. So we discussed knowledge, adoption, and network. That explain why it's important to understand specific policies that can address each of these market failures and accelerate the processes of change and the adoption of cleaner technologies. Okay, good. So let's take a 10-minute break, and then we'll pursue with the theoretical aspects.
I know, that's what but a lot of economists by all your
No one's using it. At some point, like you're running the whole
Yeah.
That's really it.
Yeah, then honestly, Yeah, so that's what
Maybe got sorry. This is a guarantee.
Yeah, I didn't hear you like.
Sorry to interrupt you, but this is the last bit. So bear with me for the last 50 minutes. So we were just discussing how technological change is not a smooth process, how there are several market failures, and this implies the need to understand where they occur and which policies one can design. We saw that those policies can have a positive effect, even though we also looked at quite a bit of simulations. And given that we are in the realm of what has happened recently, all of these examples that I showed to you were about clean technologies, but obviously it's hard to, we lack the distance in time to try to understand what is really working. So most of the papers we looked at, they were focusing on simulations. Nevertheless, I chose these examples because they start hinting at the idea of what is the direction of the innovation we want. And most of the technologies, as you know, the Industrial Revolution, blah, 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 I'm not going to do an history course, but we've been using what we call dirty, so high emission intensity technologies for quite a while now, and we want to understand how to move to cleaner technologies, so technologies that are going to impact the environment less harshly. So this is obviously to tackle the key market failure that we haven't yet mentioned today, that is climate change, so the environmental externality. And in the previous models that you've seen, so especially if you discuss the Nordhaus-Stern debate, the direction of technological change was considered exogenous. The idea was that the technology was a given and there was no way to endogenize it. Now we are going to see that actually we can influence technology, we can make it, and in the model we are going to discuss, Acemoglu and Coulter makes it endogenous. So it's really the idea of if technology is endogenous, can we direct technological change in the direction that we want? Can we induce innovation in some specific technologies that, in this view, it's really the idea of green growth, right? So the whole goal of the papers we're going to see, especially the Acemoglu and Coulter's paper, it raises the question, can we grow while limiting the damages we do to the planet? So, how to direct technological change? Well, it's not a novel idea. Actually, X raised it, the idea that technologies, innovation, are biased towards high-priced factors to make their use more efficient or to substitute them. So, when the price of an input varies, it induces innovation in a way, because it becomes more and more costly to produce with the same amount of input. So either you want to reduce the quantity of input that you're using to produce the same quantity of output, or you want to try to substitute the input. And that's something we're going to discuss during the seminar as well. So this concept has reappeared more recently as directed technical/technological change, showing that it's not just the price effect, but also the market size and the regulatory effects, or the policies that are going to affect the direction of innovation. In the context of energy, this means that an increase in the relative price of fossil fuels compared to other sources of energy could foster innovation and the diffusion of cleaner technologies, right? And that's actually what we are seeing. With an increase in the price of fuel and gasoline is what can trigger the adoption of electric vehicles, the use or the installation of solar panels, of better isolation, etc. So this is the key idea here that we're going to study. It all boils down to the idea that research and development is a profit-motivated investment activity. So the direction of innovation is here likely to respond towards increased relative prices. And there is evidence, as I was saying, of the effect of price shocks on the direction of innovation. So there is this first paper in 1999 that shows that following oil price hikes, innovation in air conditioners has shifted towards more energy efficient units. This paper from POP, same idea, higher energy prices are associated with significant increase in energy saving innovation. So that's more from the supply side. This Aguillon paper as well in 2016 showing that fuel taxes have a significant impact in the direction of innovation in the automobile industry. And he compares, in a famous example, he compares the price of Ford stocks to Tesla stocks. And the paper we're going to discuss this week, the Dubois and Girardin, on natural gas prices and how it has fostered induced innovation in different sectors. So this is mostly from the supply side, and obviously from the demand side, from the consumer perspective. There are also related effects of those increase in energy prices. Environmental policies, so it's not only about price shocks that are mostly due in the case of energy to geopolitical events or discoveries like for shale gas. Environmental policies, they can also induce innovations, and indeed environmental regulations, they tend to force firms to allocate some inputs, labor or capital, to pollution reduction or restrict the choice of technologies and inputs in the production process. They can be, in a way, modeled as extra cost on inputs, for instance. And the theory of induced innovations argue that such costs induce firms, so this is really the idea of induced technological change, to innovate in the hope of offsetting the extra cost, at least partially. And that is what we saw last week with the example of, this should be updated, Dubois 2025, where she looks at the effect of the Montreal Protocol that aimed to reduce the hole in the ozone layer by preventing the use of CFC, so the harmful molecule, and this has triggered innovation, as she shows progressively, and the fact that innovation was also sustained over time, and at the end, CFC were completely substituted by a cleaner technology. There is, as I was saying, other examples showing that environment policy can also boost demand and increase market size. However, as you know, and as we discussed, the distributional aspect of such policies are widely debated. And in the first lecture we had together, I was showing to you this paper that shows how it's mostly higher income people that benefit from subsidies, especially when switching technologies implies a high fixed cost. Okay. So let's look at the trends in green patenting to understand how green innovation has been evolving over time. And actually, since the development of climate policy, so since around the 90s, we have seen an increase in green patenting. So here in this paper from Popp and co-authors, you can see that there are, each line represents one type of technology, slash green technology. And you can see that most of them, there we see an increase. However, around 2011, there's been a big drop in patenting. Do you know why? Yes, in the back.
Shell, right?
Yeah. Same thing. So indeed, do you want to say a bit more about that?
Yeah, well, that was the hydraulic fracking revolution. I think it was like Obama era. And then obviously Shell came along, and that's the U-turn.
So indeed, this innovation that we were seeing, it was partly fostered by like public policies, etc., but it was also driven from the firm's perspective by the fact that fuel prices have been rising relatively consistently since the 80s. But in 2011, there's the discovery of shale gas, and given that it's very cheap, it decreases the price of the dirty energy, limiting, disincentivizing in a way green patenting, and that's what we see here. So the possible explanation, so here again, it's not causal, it's just a few interpretations. It's not only shale gas as we are going to see, but since then, worry not, there has been an increase again. Not as big as this peak, but nevertheless, the trend has been improving. I was just unable to find graphs showing it. And so there is the shale gas revolution. There are diminishing returns to research as well. The fact that perhaps wind and solar energy are now mature technologies, so there are fewer patents around them. And then now what we need is some enabling technologies, but so decrease, just the fact that there were fewer discoveries in this sector, as well as weakened regulations. And we see with the second Trump mandate, for instance, how this can influence and motivate or not research, given that he has reduced quite substantially green research subsidies. And there was also perhaps another explanation is the fact that there was perhaps some kind of a clean tech bubble at the time, with a very high increase, but to the point that people were like having more and more patents, and it was not really realistic in a way. Okay, so there's this idea, so we were looking at technologies, and now talking about green technologies. So how to really make sure that we can achieve the clean transition, where the idea is that environmental and technology policies should work best in tandem. So environmental policies here, they are mostly understood as a price instrument, so a Pigouvian fee, a carbon price. And the technology policy, as we were discussing, it can try to orient, to be directed towards environmental, so the cleaner sector, through, for instance, targeted research subsidies, but it can also be just a simple technological policy in order, like for industrial purposes, for instance. And the fact having a technological policy but no environmental policy, the risk is to have environmental innovation but no incentive to adopt it. On the other hand, having environmental policy but no technology policy is to have, the risk is to have the under provision of new technologies, so lock-in, where there's not enough R&D for all the reasons that we discussed earlier. The market could focus on technologies that are closest to what exists already, but there may not, market-based instrument may not provide incentives for research on long-term needs. And we know that we need fundamental R&D to solve at least part of the climate crisis, as discussed in one of the few slides when we were looking at the modeling of the International Energy Agency. So if forced to choose between the two, well, obviously from an environmental perspective, it's more rational to choose the instrument that's going to tackle the first order problem, so the environmental instrument. But using both, as we are going to see, allows emissions reduction to be achieved at a significantly lower cost. And when we are talking about a lower cost, it's really the idea of having a lower social cost of carbon, so a lower carbon tax. Okay. So what is really important for early stage technologies is to understand the fact that for mature technologies, the costs are unlikely to be dynamic. So when the technology is mature, in general, we assume that we have already reached the lowest cost of production, more or less, broadly saying. So in that case, a carbon tax is supposed to foster adoption. On the other hand, for early stage technologies, here dynamic costs are key. So innovation, learning by doing, all those subsidies that we were discussing can really be key here. And the key idea from the Acemoglu paper is the fact that a carbon tax can, in theory, foster both innovation and adoption. But given that there are several market failures in the technology change process, it's better to pair it with policies that directly affect technologies. So here, it's the idea of a combination of policies using both carbon prices and, for instance, targeted research subsidies, so research subsidies that are targeted toward the clean sector. Questions so far? Okay. So this is just to add a little bit on the fact that we need to understand how people account for the cost. In general, it's not really central in policy discussion, but this is quite important. And we also want to think about the irreversibility of many energy investments. Indeed, there is a clear path dependency, especially when you think of electric installations. For instance, this is not extremely flexible. So there's a risk of a technological lock-in. And this is an idea that I find quite interesting because we may actually, because given that technological progress takes a while, we may be locking ourselves into low carbon energy, for instance, using natural gas that clearly has a lower carbon emission intensity than coal, for instance. But we may, by doing that, lock ourselves into a trap where actually we are not, with this kind of technology, we are never going to achieve zero carbon. So there's really this debate of trying to not be myopic, think carefully about the kind of energy supply networks that we are going to develop, because then it's really unflexible. And actually, the goal in theory is not to achieve low emission intensity, but really to reach zero carbon emissions. So there is, this is just one additional note on this kind of debate. Okay. So to wrap up on this part, the idea of induced innovation and climate policy is the fact that abatement costs are a critical input to the cost-benefit analysis of climate policy. So if they are high, no one is abating, and climate policy is not worth it from CBA perspective. Innovation is a key mechanism for trying to decrease abatement costs. As we saw, progressively costs are decreasing, in part due to learning by doing. Innovation is, however, not a completely exogenous process. It can be influenced through subsidies, and we saw that subsidies seem to work when it comes to fostering innovation. So the conclusion is that innovation policy should be an endogenous variable, just as tax policy is. So we have all those models where we try to find the tax rate that is equal to the marginal cost, etc. So most economic analysis, they were using computable general equilibrium models, such as the DICE model that we discussed last week, taking technology exogenous. And now we're going to see how to endogenize technology in a model. Questions? Okay, so let's dig in. Models of directed technological change or technical change. I never know which one is which, but I guess that they are more or less the same because they're used indifferently. So the idea is that induced innovation can be embedded in a macro growth model where the direction of technical change is endogenous. This clearly is the key paper on the topic, the Acemoglu, Aguian, Burdin, Emus 2012 in the American Economic Review. It illustrates the conceptual issues of endogenizing technology and allow us to consider what the optimal policy intervention is. So whether it's tax versus research subsidies, whether it's a temporary versus permanent type of policy that we need to implement, whether it's more important to do it now or later. So we are not going to discuss all of these aspects today. We are mostly going to focus on the main bits of the model. And if you want to know more, you can have a look at the paper. The most important thing to remember in terms of the required reading is really to read the introduction of the paper to try to understand the first part, maybe the results with the simulation. The equations I'm going to show to you, they come from the first part of the paper, so there is no exhaustible resource here. I think that we can do without to show the key intuition of the model, but in the full paper there is a whole part that explains how we can reach resource exhaustion, etc. So I'm not going to go into that now. Okay. So here is the model. It's quite a lot of equations, as you can guess. But the key idea is that there is a representative household that maximizes its utility over time. So this is the utility function, right? Over time. And the utility is a function of the consumption of a good and environmental quality. So both play a positive role, both increase the utility of the household. So what can you tell us about what is in which direction would the discount rate play first, and what is creating the externality is the second question in those equations. Yeah.
Wait, sorry, the externality against other households would be over to the future.
So what is creating the environmental externality in the environmental quality here?
The externalities generated by the YDT, which comes from the production of XDIT, and the discounting is for the fact that we care more about today than we care about tomorrow. So like utility now is more important than utility like some time periods in the future.
Exactly. So the idea here is that you discount the future. So the further away the future is, so as t grows, basically, here in this first equation, you're going to put a lower and lower weight on your utility. So your utility today matters more than tomorrow. And in a way, it makes sense, right? So we are going to go back on the question of the discount rate. But still, it's an important parameter because this is the utility of the household. It's really what we are trying to maximize here. and the utility of the household is going to depend on the consumption of a good, Y. And actually, part of the production of this good Y, this output, it creates a negative externality. So as we produce more of the good, we deteriorate the environment. And this is captured by this parameter, let's call it eta, I don't know. What's the Greek sign for that one? I don't know. What? We'll call it? Xi? No, Xi. Xi. Okay, Xi. So we'll call it Xi. So this is the externality, and this is the discount rate. So going back to the Nordhaus and Stern debate, what would be how would they differ the discount rate in the Nordhaus view versus the Stern view? But first,
Sorry, the Xi?
yeah.
Does the inclusion of the Xi like internalize the externality of the household? Or is it just representing it? Because then I don't see how.
Here, it's really simply the idea that as you produce, the more you produce, the more you deteriorate with the dirty input, the more you deteriorate the environment.
That's the second part, but the first part, I don't.
That is the part where the more you produce, the more you deteriorate the environment. So you can see that there's a lag here. So you produce at period T, and this affects the environment at period T plus 1.
Okay. Also, that just shows the damage to S.
Exactly. So if you think about it, you can think of a very basic good like GDP. We are trying to increase GDP, but the more the economy grows, the more it deteriorates the environment. Okay, and there's a little bit of a lag. So when GDP grows, economic activity grows, it's going to affect the environmental quality at the next period. Okay, so it's like in a way some aspects of climate change, climate damages, etc. Okay, so going back to this idea of the discount rate, how does it differ between Stern and Nordhaus?
So based on Stern, the discount rate should be much lower to put more weight on today's utility, coming from, in this case, consumption and the environmental quality, and based on Nordhaus, it should be higher and more based on, at the end, financial market data, so quite close to the interest rate, putting less weight on today's utility.
Yes, that's the idea. So we are going to look, because in this Acemoglu paper, they look at different parameters of the discount rate. And basically, the higher the discount rate here, the lower the weight you put on the future. So basically, you have fewer incentives to implement environmental policies now. And Stern, he tends to consider that the discount rate, so the value you put on the future should be about the same as the value you put on today. Okay. Is this clear? Questions? Yes.
What is the QT and what is the RT?
Yes. So QT-RT, I should have removed it. It's the bit that I was discussing on the exhaustion of resources that we are not going to consider in the first version, the simplest version of the model. But it's also something that's embedded in the Acemoglu model, where the resource can get exhausted after a certain while. So we are not going to consider this bit. I will change the slides and remove it. And if you read the first part of the paper, they actually say that all the first results are without this bit. That complexifies the model a little bit. And so basically, the consumption. So as I was saying, these representative households, derives utility from consuming a certain good, C, and the environmental quality. C, it's defined as follow. It's basically the total output, so Y, minus the cost of using some inputs here. And you can have a look right away at those subscripts here. You're going to see them all the time in this model. So C will represent the clean sector and D the dirty sector. So here, the consumption of the good, so more or less, you can think of a monetary good, frankly, is equal to the amount that is being produced minus the cost of using the machines to produce the good. Okay. You're gonna, in this paper, the environment quality is also quite important because as it decreases, the utility substantially decreases. So it's, in a way, you have this dual idea that on the one hand, we want to see consumption, so output grow, right? But there is this tension with the environment because the environment quality is affected by the growth of the output. And this is really where the tension lies. Question?
Just a question on the environmental quality equation. It should be 1 minus delta, no? It's a decay rate? Or?
No, actually, sorry. I forgot to say that. It's the opposite. It's the natural renewal rate of the nature. So you can think that at time t, the nature grows a little bit, reaching the next output of nature. So it's like trees growing, etc., etc. But there is this counteracting force that is really the production that damages the nature. Okay? So if the externality was not happening, it would be a positive flow. Okay? Nature would be thriving in a way at rate delta. All good? Okay. Just so you know, for the exam, you don't need to remember those equations, etc. It's really the intuition that you have to understand. Okay. So actually, so you saw that the consumption of the good from which the utility depends, it's actually this good, this output, this total output from the economy called YT. And YT, as it comes, it is a function of both clean, so with this subscript C, and D, the dirty input. So there are two types of input. The parameter epsilon, it governs how easily one input can substitute each other. It's actually the most important parameter of all the model. Can one tell us how the value of epsilon is going to affect the substitution between the two inputs? So epsilon, as I was saying, it governs the substitution patterns between the clean input and the dirty input. So you can think that to produce GDP, you can use both petroleum, but you can also use clean electricity, for instance. And those two inputs allow to produce the final good. Okay? So epsilon is governing this idea, is driving, it's the key parameter that really conveys this idea of how one can substitute clean energy and dirty energy. So if you think of your house, you can sometimes switch from renewable to nuclear energy. So, but there are some goods for which it's not possible. There are some inputs that are not good substitutes with one another. So how, from this equation, do you expect epsilon to affect the substitution patterns? So basically what I would like you to say is when epsilon is high, this is what we should expect. When epsilon is low, when epsilon is close to 1 versus to 0, etc. Yes?
I believe I'm not sure, but I believe when it's high, it's quite substitutable, and when it's low, it's not very substitutable.
Exactly. So the higher the epsilon, the strongest the substitutes we have. So the easiest it is in the production function to substitute the dirty input with the clean input. So ideally, this is what we want, right? To try, and what will happen if we substitute the dirty input with the clean input? Well, it's actually a super positive effect on the utility of the representative household, because we can produce as much, okay, as much as before when we were using both input, the dirty and the clean one. So we can have a high consumption, playing positively in the utility, and it's not going to affect the environmental quality. So we have the highest environmental quality as possible. So it's exactly what we want, okay? On the other end, the lower the epsilon parameter, so basically, if you have a very high epsilon, you almost have a linear function. On the other end, if you have a very low epsilon, the problem is that it's like as if you were multiplying. It's like a Cobb-Douglas function, right? So it would be as if you were having here the clean output and say something like that, and here the dirty input, and you multiply them, meaning that when you have 0, so when you decrease as much as you can the dirty input, you also have 0 for the output. That's the idea of complements. Okay? Is this clear? Everyone looks like super puzzled, so tell me.
What happens
Yes.
when it's 1?
Sorry?
What happens when epsilon is 1?
When it's 1 and when it's 0, it's actually not defined. Okay, the function. You can see that you would have a 0 at the denominator. So it's a case that they don't study in the paper. It's just not defined. So the idea is like you look at high values of epsilon, you look at epsilon moving towards 1 being the limit, and then you look at between 1 and 0, you have this complementary case of the dirty and the clean inputs. But actually, in this paper, they're mostly going to look at positive values of epsilon, because the whole argument is that the dirty technology can be substituted with the clean technology. So if you always need the dirty technology, if you think that you can never get rid away of coal, then you have it's not working in this model. Okay. So, to produce, and this is not something super important, so I'm not going to expand too much on that, but basically, there is, so, the key idea, there is this representative household that is both consuming the main good produced by the society, that we can call GDP or whatever, that we will call Y here in the model, okay, so this minus the cost, and the household also benefits from high environmental quality. The good that the household consumes, this is its production function. It depends both on the clean and the dirty input. Those inputs, they can be substitutes, and this is what we are going to study, and that's the key message of the paper, as we are going to see. Next, there is an intermediate step where basically Acemoglu and co-authors are looking at how to produce these clean and dirty inputs. So that's what we are seeing here. Basically, each intermediate good, so each input has to be produced. And that's where we are here. You have the clean input that is produced as a function. The production function of the clean input depends on labor in the clean sector, A, that is the quality, the productivity of the machine, and C, the quantity of the machine, okay? And similarly, in the dirty sector, again, here I have removed all the part on the exhaustible resource. For the dirty sector, similarly, you need labor and machines, okay? What you can have a look at the model. I hope it's going to get clearer when you look at it. But basically, this is just to hint at the fact that this parameter is going to be quite important. This is really the quality, the productivity of the machine. So either you can have a lot of machines, or you can have more productive machines, okay? And of course, as we are talking about innovation, we are going to be interested in this parameter. Now, there are scientists. I'm adding a new agent to the model. Scientists, they have to decide whether they are going to innovate, whether they are going to work in one sector or the other. So basically, they can decide whether to work in the clean or the dirty sector. And their choice is going to affect the productivity of the machine in that sector. Okay? So basically, here you have this subscript J that indicates that can be equal to C or D, whether we are in the clean or the dirty sector, right? And so the total sum of scientists, it's equal to 1. Each scientist, every period, has to decide whether to work in the clean or the dirty sector. And there are all these parameters that relate to the idea of the probability of an innovation being successful in one sector and quality improvement from successful innovations. But basically, what you have to remember at this stage is really that the productivity today of the machine in one sector depends on the amount of the scientists today and the productivity at the period before. So there's really this idea that if you start working in a sector that has more productivity, you're going to have a much higher likelihood of having a better productivity in the next period compared to choosing sectors with a low productivity initially. And given that if I don't wrap up, I'm going to run out of time, the whole idea is that there is this whole model, it introduces path dependency. So the idea is that technological improvement is cumulative. Innovation, so A, so the improvement in the quality of the machine, builds on past technological progress, so the quality of the machine at the period before. And this is the idea of standing on the shoulders of giants. You don't start from scratch. Every time you improve the quality of a machine, it means that there was already a good quality and so on. So you build up in a way. And so the idea is that there is a knowledge externality and some path dependency. If a sector is very productive, scientists have an interest in joining that sector. And that's what's happening here. We start in the paper from a situation where the dirty sector is the sector that has the most machines. Say it's before we discovered that there is climate change, etc. and actually depicts the situation we are nowadays quite well. And so there is an incentive for scientists, in a way, to build on those dirty innovations and to join the dirty sector. And this means that innovation is going to accumulate in the dirty sector instead of moving to the cleaner sector. And so that's what we are trying to correct with the research subsidy that is proposed in the paper. And because I don't have a lot of time at all left, I'm going to let you look at the slides. But basically, they reach this this equilibrium, this profit equilibrium condition. Yes.
I have one question about like the previous reasoning where we say that if a lot of research has been done, it's more likely to join that industry as a researcher. Because once you have a lot of research it's done, like the marginal like productivity of joining that like industry in research will like be lower than in the clean.
It's true.